Section 7 of Tales from the Works of G.A.Henty. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tales from the Works of G.A.Henty by G.A.Henty. A Cyclone in the Bay of Bengal, from A Chapter of Adventures. Jack Robson, Arthur Hill, Jim Tucker, are three midshipmen on board the Wild Wave, when in the Bay of Bengal the appearance of the weather changes, and the captain orders most of the sails to be taken in. "What is it all about?" Arthur Hill asked his companions, as the three boys gathered together after the work was done. "Why, there is not a breath of wind. Is it all done for practice, do you think?" Jim shook his head. "I expect we're going to have one of those cyclones Mr. Timmins was speaking about the other day, though I don't see any signs of it, except the queer color of the sky. I expect the glass must have been going down very fast. There is the captain popping into his cabin again. Well, he is not long about it," he added, as Captain Murchison hurried out again and spoke to Mr. Timmins, who immediately gave the order, "Furl the mizzen and main topsails! Lower down the fore staysail!" "Well, there can't be more to do now," Jack said, when the order was carried out, "unless we get to work to set them all again." "Look, Jack!" Arthur Hill said, grasping his arm and pointing away on the starboard beam. A wall of black mist seemed to hang upon the horizon, rising every moment higher and higher. "The squall is coming, lads!" the captain shouted. "When it strikes her, hold on for your lives! Carpenter, put a man with an axe on each of the weather shrouds. We may have to cut away before we have done with it." All eyes were now turned toward the bank of cloud, which was rising with extraordinary rapidity. Small portions of the upper line seemed at times to be torn off and to rush ahead of the main body, and then to disappear, suddenly blown into fragments. A low moaning sound was heard, and a line of white could be made out at the foot of the cloud bank. The water around the ship was as smooth as glass, though there was a slight swell which swayed her to and fro, and caused the shrouds and blocks to rattle. Louder and louder grew the murmur. Again the captain's voice was heard. "Hold on for your lives, lads!" And then, with a scream and roar, as of 1,000 railway whistles, the gale struck the ship. So tremendous was the force, that although the closely reefed foretopsail was the only sail that the Wild Wave was showing aloft, for the jib blew out from the bolt ropes the instant the squall struck her, the vessel heeled over and over until her lee rail was under water. Further and further she went, until the ends of the yards were under water, and the sea seemed to Jack, who was holding on by the weather bulwark, as if it were directly under his feet. He thought that the ship was going to capsize, and had not her cargo been well stowed, she must have done so. She was now almost on her beam ends, pressed down by the action of the wind upon her hull rather than her masts, and had it not been that the boys had each at the last moment twisted a rope around his body, they must have dropped into the water, for the deck afforded no hold whatever to their feet. Jack felt completely bewildered at the noise and fury of the wind. He had thought that after the gale they had passed through south of the Cape he knew what bad weather was, but this was beyond anything of which he had the slightest conception. A Cyclone 2. Looking round, he saw Mr. Timmins clinging to the bulwarks, and making his way along with the greatest difficulty until he reached the sailor stationed with the axe at the mizzen shrouds. He saw the man rise from his crouching position, and, holding on to the bulwarks, strike 3 blows on the lanyards. Then there was a crash, and the mizzen mast broke suddenly off 4 feet above the deck, and fell into the sea. Jack thought that the vessel lifted a little, for he could see one more streak of the deck planking. Mr. Timmins looked round towards the captain, who was clinging to the wheel. The latter waved his hand, and the mate again began to make his way forward. He passed the boys without a word, for the loudest shout would have been inaudible in the howling of the wind. He stopped at the main shrouds again. The axe descended, and the mainmast went over the side. The relief from the weight of the mast and the pressure of the wind upon it was immediate. The Wild Wave rose with a surge, and her lee rail appeared above the surface. Then she rose no more. Mr. Timmins looked back again at the captain, but the latter made no sign. He could see that the pressure of the wind upon the foremast was beginning to pay the vessel's head off before it. As it did so she slowly righted, until, when fairly before the wind, she was upon a level keel. Then there was a dull explosion heard even above the gale, and the fore topsail split into ribbons. But the ship was now before the gale, and was scudding, from the effect of the wind on the bare poles and hull alone, at great speed through the water. As soon as she had righted, the lads threw off their lashings, but still clung tight to the rail, and struggled aft till they stood under the shelter of the poop. "This is something like!" Jim roared at the top of his voice into Jack's ear. Even then his words could scarcely be heard. Jack nodded. At present, even had conversation been possible, he would have had no inclination for it, for he felt stunned and bewildered. It had all taken place in 10 minutes. It was but that time since the ship had been lying motionless on a still ocean. Now she was rushing with one mast only standing, before a furious gale, and had had the narrowest possible escape from destruction. As yet the sea had scarce begun to rise, but seemed flattened under the terrific pressure of the wind, which scooped hollows in it and drove the water before it in fine spray. Jack had read in the papers about tornadoes in America, and how houses were sometimes bodily lifted with their contents and carried long distances, and how everything above the surface was swept away as if a scythe had passed over it. He had heard these accounts discussed by the fishermen, and the general opinion in Lee, Jack's home, was that there was mighty little truth in them. The Lee men thought they knew what a gale was, and what it could do. They knew that chimney pots and tiles could be carried some distance with the wind, that arms of trees could be twisted off, and that an empty boat could be carried a considerable distance. But that a house could be bodily whirled away was going so far beyond anything that came within their experience as to be wholly disbelieved. But Jack knew now, as he looked round, that this and more was possible. He felt the whole vessel leap and quiver as each gust struck her, and this with only one bare pole standing, and he would have been scarcely surprised now had the ship herself been lifted bodily from the water. A Cyclone 3. As to walking along the deck, it would have been impossible. No man could have forced his way against the wind, and Jack felt that, were he to attempt to move from the sheltered spot where he was standing, he would be taken up and carried away as if he were but a figure of straw. Presently Mr. Hoare came down from the poop and dived into the cabin, making a sign to the lads to follow him. He stood there for a minute panting with his exertions. "The captain has sent me down here for a spell," he said. "He and the first and Jack Moore are all lashed to the wheel. Sometimes I thought that all 4 of us, wheel and all, would have been blown right away. Well, lads, this is a cyclone, and you may live 100 years and never see such another. You had better stop in here, for you might get blown right away, and can be of no good on deck. There is nothing to do. The wind has got her, and will take her where it likes. We can do nothing but keep her straight. There will be a tremendous sea before long. The water at the upper part of the bay is shallow, and we shall have a sea like yours at the mouth of the Thames, Jack, only on a big scale. Our lives are in God's hands, boys. Don't forget to ask for help where alone it can be obtained. Now I must go up again. Do you know, lads, my sides fairly ache. Once or twice I was pressed against the wheel with such force that I could scarcely breathe, and if I had been pinned there by an elephant butting me, I could not have been more powerless. That is right, steward. Get me my oilskin and sou'wester from the cabin. You had better get a kettle on for over the spirit stove, so that we may have a cup of hot cocoa when we like. Now then, I am ready for the fray again." And buttoning himself up closely, Mr. Hoare went on deck again. Jack Moore was the next to come down. "Well, young gentlemen," said he, "this is a gale, and no mistake. I have been at sea over 30 years, and never saw anything to be compared with it. If you get through this, you need never be afraid of another, even if you live to be white-headed." After Jack Moore had gone up, Mr. Timmins and the captain came down by turns. Each took a cup of cocoa. They said but few words to the boys, and were indeed almost too much exhausted by the struggle through which they had gone to be able to speak. The boys gathered again under the lee of the poop, and watched the scene. It had changed considerably. The wind seemed as violent as ever, but the sea was no longer kept in subjection to it, and was now tossing itself in a wild and confused manner. Another half hour, and it had settled into some sort of regularity, and was sweeping before the wind in deep trough-like waves with steep sides, resembling those to which Jack had been accustomed at home on a gigantic scale. Soon again these were broken up, and were succeeded by a wild tumultuous sea like a boiling cauldron. The vessel was thrown violently from side to side, taking water over, now on one beam, now on the other, and at times shaking from blows as if she had struck upon a rock. So sharp and sudden were her movements that the lads could not keep their feet, and again made their way into the cabin. Even here it was necessary to shout in order to be heard. A Cyclone 4. "What an extraordinary sea, Jim! I never saw anything like it before." "This is what does it," Jim replied, pointing to the telltale compass hanging from the beams overhead. Jack glanced at it. "Why, we are running due south." "Aye, and I expect we have been 2 or 3 times round the compass already. That is what makes the frightful broken sea." "Well, as long as we keep on running round and round," Jack said, "there is no fear of our running against the land anywhere." Jim was further advanced in the study of navigation. "You forget," he said, "the center of the cyclone is moving along all the time, and though we may go round and round the center, we are still moving in the same direction the cyclone is going, whatever that may be." For hours the storm raged without the slightest signs of abatement. The sea was now terrific, the waist of the ship was full of water. Green seas swept over the vessel's bows, carrying everything before them, and pouring aft burst open the cabin door and deluged the cabin. By turns the boys made their way to the door and looked out. "Come on, you fellows!" Jim Tucker shouted after one of these trips of investigation. "The men are coming out from the forecastle. There is something to be done." The boys came out and crawled a few steps up the poop ladder, holding on for life as they did so. They did not attempt to get on to the poop, for they felt they would be blown away if they exposed themselves there to the full force of the wind. Looking round, the scene was terrible. The surface of the sea was almost hidden by the clouds of spray blown from the heads of the waves. A sky that was inky black hung overhead. The sea, save for the white heads, was of similar hue, but ahead there seemed a gleam of light. Jim Tucker, holding on by the rail, raised himself 2 or 3 feet higher to have a better view. A moment was sufficient. He sprang down and shouted in his comrades' ears, "Breakers ahead!" It needed no further words. The light ahead was the gleam of a sea of white foam towards which the vessel was hurrying. Nothing could be done to check or change her course. Had the mizzen been standing, an effort might have been made to show a little sail upon it, and bring her head up into the wind to anchor. But even could this have been done, the cables would have snapped like pack-threads. There was nothing for it but destruction. Jack followed Jim's example, crawled to the top of the gangway, and holding on by the poop rail, raised himself to his feet and looked forward. Right across their bows stretched a band of white breakers, and beyond, through the mist, he could make out the line of a low shore. The lads descended again into the waist, and with great difficulty made their way forward to where the men were huddled together round the entrance to the forecastle. They too had kept a lookout, and knew of the danger into which they were running, and the impossibility of avoiding it. "Is there anything to be done?" Jim Tucker shouted. A silent shake of the head was a sufficient answer. The vessel and all in her were doomed. The officers were now seen leaving the helm and coming forward. It was a proof in itself of the hopelessness of the prospect. The vessel was indeed steering herself straight before the gale, and as there were no regular following waves, there was no fear of her broaching to. The boats, that had at the commencement of the storm been hanging from the davits, were all gone or useless. 1 or 2 had been smashed to pieces by heavy seas striking them. Others had been torn from their fastenings and blown clean away. The long boat alone remained lashed amidships on the deck. Jack pointed to her, but an old sailor shook his head and pointed to the sea. No boat could hope to live in it a minute. Once in the breakers it would be swamped instantly. The officers made their way forward. "It is all over, lads," the captain shouted, "but some of us may reach the shore on pieces of the wreck as she breaks up. We will get the longboat ready for launching. Some of you may cling to her. Now, lads, let us shake hands all round, and meet our fate as British sailors should do, calmly and bravely. Perhaps, who knows, some of us may be saved yet." A Cyclone 5. The crew of the Wild Wave had been a happy one. Discipline had been good, although every indulgence had been allowed the men, and all were fond of their officers. There was a silent handclasp all round, and then some of the sailors followed the officers to the boat. As they did so, they knew well that the order was given merely to keep them employed, for that the chance of any one being washed ashore and reaching it alive through the tremendous surf was small indeed. As they cut away the boat's cover they looked round, and a low cry broke from several of them. The ship was close to the broken water. Every man clung to something and awaited the shock. In a few seconds it came, As she descended a wave there was a tremendous shock, followed instantly by a crash as the foremast went over the bow. Another and another, accompanied each time with a sound of rending timbers. "Cut away the lashings of the boat!" the captain shouted, drawing his knife and setting the example. As he did so he touched Jack and pointed to the bottom of the boat. The lad understood him. He was to put in the plugs, which at ordinary times were left out to allow any rain water to escape as it fell. Jack in turn touched Arthur, and the two climbed into the boat to replace the plugs. As they did so, a fiercer gust than usual struck the vessel. The lashings of the longboat had just been cut, and the gale seized it and raised it in the air as if it had been made of paper. Jack and Arthur uttered a cry, and involuntarily clung for life to the thwarts. Over and over they were whirled. Confused, giddy, scarce knowing what had happened, they clung on. It was a sort of nightmare, and how long it lasted they knew not. Presently there was a terrific crash, and they knew no more. When Jack opened his eyes, he lay for some time wondering where he was, and what had become of him. There were stars in the sky overhead, but the light was stealing over it, and he felt that it was daybreak. There was a loud, dull, roaring sound in his ears, a sound he could not understand, for not even a breath of wind fanned his cheek. At last, slowly, the facts came to his mind. There had been a great storm. The vessel was among the breakers. He had got into the longboat with Arthur to put in the plugs. They had been lifted up and blown away. And then suddenly Jack sat upright. It was light enough for him to see that he was still in the boat, but its back was broken and its side staved in. Around him was a mass of tangled foliage, and close beside him lay Arthur Hill, the blood slowly oozing from a terrible gash in his forehead. Jack leaned over and raised him, and loudly shouted his name in his ear. With a sigh Arthur opened his eyes. "What is it, Jack?" he asked feebly. "We are saved, old man. We have been blown right ashore in the boat, and we have both gotten shaken and hurt a bit, but, thank God, we are both alive." "Where are we?" Arthur asked, looking round. "As far as I can see," Jack replied, "we are in the middle of a grove of trees that have been blown down by the gale, and the leaves and branches have broken our fall. Otherwise we must have been smashed up. We must have been lying here for at least 10 hours. It was just about 6 o'clock when we struck, for I looked at the clock in the cabin the last time we were down there, and as the sun will be up before long, it must be getting on 5 now. Now let us try to get out of this." With the greatest difficulty, for they were still weak and terribly shaken, the boys made their way through the tangle of trees and branches into which they had so providently fallen. Both uttered an exclamation of surprise as they reached the edge of the wood. The sea was nearly half a mile away. A tremendous surf was still breaking, and for a quarter of a mile out a band of white breakers extended along the shore. There were no signs of the wild wave. End of Section 7. Recording by Todd.
Section 8 of Tales from the Works of G.A.Henty. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tales from the Works of G.A.Henty by G.A.Henty. The Flood in Pine Tree Gulch. From Tales of Daring and Danger. A lad known as White-Faced Dick, in a mining camp in California, had received much rough kindness from a miner called Red George. Heavy rain had fallen among the hills, and the channel through which the stream running through the valley had been diverted was insufficient to carry away the water that came down. Dick, who was a weakly lad altogether, unfitted for the rough working of mining, had made up his mind to go east to his native village. As he was sitting thinking it over, his thoughts came back to Pine Tree Gulch, and he started to his feet. Could he be mistaken? Were his eyes deceiving him? No. Among the stones and boulders of the old bed of the Yuba there was the gleam of water, and even as he watched it, he could see it widening out. He started to run down the hill to give the alarm, but before he was half-way he paused, for there were loud shouts, and a scene of bustle and confusion instantly arose. The cradles were deserted, and the men working on the surface loaded themselves with their tools and made for the high ground. while those at the windlasses worked their hardest to draw up their comrades below. A man coming down from above stopped close to Dick, with a low cry, and stood gazing, with a white scared face. Dick had worked with him. He was one of the company to which Keel George belonged. "What is it, Saunders?" "They are lost," the man replied. "I was at the windlass when they shouted up to me to go up and fetch them something from the huts. They had just struck the gold rich." Dick understood at once. Red George and his mates were still in the bottom of the shaft, ignorant of the danger which was threatening them. "Come on," he cried. "We shall be in time yet," and at the top of his speed dashed down the hill, followed by Saunders. "What is it? What is it?" asked parties of men mounting the hill. "Red George's gang are still below." Dick's eyes were fixed on the water. There was a broad band now of yellow with a white edge down the center of the stony flat, and it was widening with terrible rapidity. It was scarce 10 yards from the windlass at the top of Red George's shaft when Dick, followed closely by Saunders, reached it. "Come up, mates, quick for your lives! The river is rising. You will be flooded out directly. Every one else has gone." As he spoke he pulled at the rope by which the bucket was hanging, and the handles of the windlass flew round rapidly as it descended. When it had run out, Dick and he grasped the handles. "All right below?" An answering call came up, and the two began their work, throwing their whole strength into it. Quickly as the windlass revolved, it seemed an endless time to Dick before the bucket came up, and the first man stepped out. It was not Red George. Dick had hardly expected it to be. Red George would be sure to see his two mates up before him, and the man uttered a cry of alarm as he saw the water now within a few feet of the mouth of the shaft. The Flood in Pine Tree Gulch 2. It was a torrent now, for not only was it coming through the dam, but it was rushing down in cascades from the new channel. Without a word the miner placed himself facing Dick, and the moment the bucket was again down the three grasped the handles. But quickly as they worked, the edge of the water was within a few inches of the shaft when the next man reached the surface, but again the bucket descended before the rope tightened. However, the water had begun to run over the lip, at first in a mere trickle and then, almost instantaneously, in a cascade which grew larger and larger. The bucket was half-way up when a sound like thunder was heard. The ground seemed to tremble under their feet, and then at the turn of the valley above a great wave of yellow water, crested with foam, was seen tearing along at the speed of a racehorse. "The dam has burst!" Saunders shouted. "Run for your lives, or we are all lost!" The three men dropped the handles and ran at full speed towards the shore, while loud shouts to Dick to follow came from the crowd of men standing on the slope. But the boy still grasped the handles, and with lips tightly closed still toiled on. Slowly the bucket ascended, for Red George was a heavy man. Then suddenly the weight slackened, and the handle went round faster. The shaft was filling. The water had reached the bucket, and had risen to Red George's neck, so that his weight was no longer on the rope. So fast did the water pour in that it was not half a minute before the bucket reached the surface, and Red George sprang out. There was but time for one exclamation, and then the great wave struck them. Red George was whirled like a straw in the current, but he was a strong swimmer, and at a point where the valley widened out, half a mile lower, he struggled to shore. 2 days later the news reached Pine Tree Gulch that a boy's body had been washed ashore 20 miles down, and 10 men, headed by Red George, went and brought it solemnly back to Pine Tree Gulch. There, among the stumps of pine trees, a grave was dug, and there, in the presence of the whole camp, White-faced Dick was laid to rest. Pine Tree Gulch in a solitude now. The trees are growing again, and none would dream that it was once a busy scene of industry. But if the traveller searches among the pine trees, he will find a stone with the words, "Here lies White-faced Dick, who died to save Red George." What can a man do more than give his life for a friend? Red George worked no more at the diggings. After seeing the stone laid in its place, he went east, bought a small farm, and settled down there. But to the end of his life he was never weary of telling those who would listen to it the story of Pine Tree Gulch. End of section 8.
Section 9 of Tales from the Works of G.A.Henty. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tales from the Works of G.A.Henty by G.A.Henty. A Brush with the Chinese, and What Came of It. From Tales of Daring and Danger, Part 1. It was early in December that HMS Perseus was cruising off the mouth of the Canton River. War had been declared with China in consequence of her continued evasions of the treaty she had made with us, and it was expected that a strong naval force would soon gather to bring her to reason. In the meantime, the ships on the station had a busy time of it, chasing the enemy's junks when they ventured to show themselves beyond the reach of the guns of their forts, and occasionally having a brush with the piratical boats which took advantage of the general confusion to plunder friend as well as foe. The Perseus had that afternoon chased 2 government junks up a creek. The sun had already set when they took refuge there, and the captain did not care to send his boats after them in the dark, as many of the creeks ran up for miles into the flat country. As the creeks not unfrequently had many arms or branches, the boats might, in the dark, miss the junks altogether. Orders were issued that 4 boats should be ready for starting at daybreak the next morning. The Perseus anchored off the mouth of the creek, and 2 boats were ordered to row backwards and forwards off its mouth all night to ensure that the enemy did not slip out in the darkness. Jack Fothergill, the senior midshipman, was commanding the gig, and 2 of the other midshipmen were going to the pinnace and launch, commanded respectively by the first lieutenant and the master. The 3 other midshipmen of the Perseus were loud in their lamentations that they were not to share in the fun. "You can't all go, you know," Fothergill said, "and it's no use making a noise about it. The captain has been very good to let 3 of us go." "It's all very well for you, Jack," Percy Adcock, the youngest of the lads, replied, "because you are one of those chosen, and it is not so hard for Simmons and Linthorpe, because they went the other day in the boat that chased those junks under shelter of the guns of their battery. But I haven't had a chance for ever so long." "What fun was there in chasing the junks?" Simmons said. "We never got near the Chinese till they were close to their battery. Then just as the first shot came singing from their guns, and we thought that we were going to have some excitement, the first lieutenant sung out, 'Easy all!' and there was nothing for it but to turn around and row for the ship. And a nice hot row it was, 2 hours and a half in a broiling sun. Of course I'm not blaming Oliphant, for the captain's orders were strict, that we were not to try to cut the junks out if they got under the guns of any of their batteries. Still, it was horribly annoying, and I do think the captain might have remembered what bad luck we had last time, and given us a chance tomorrow." "It is clear we could not all go, and naturally enough the captain chose the 3 seniors. Besides, if you did have bad luck last time, you had your chance, and I don't suppose we shall have anything more exciting now. These fellows always set up fire to their junks and row for the shore directly they see us." after firing a shot or two wildly in our direction.
"Well, Jack, if you don't expect any fun," Simmons replied, "perhaps you wouldn't mind telling the first lieutenant you do not care to go, and that I'm very anxious to take your place. Perhaps he will be good enough to allow me to relieve you."
"A likely thing that," Fothergill laughed. "No, Tom, I am sorry you are not going, but you must make the best of it till another chance comes."
"Don't you think, Jack,"
Percy Adcock said to his senior in a coaxing tone later on,
"you could manage to smuggle me into the boat with you?"
"Not I, Percy. Suppose you got hurt. What would the captain say then? And firing as wildly as those Chinese do, a shot is just as likely to hit your little carcass as to lodge in one of the sailors. No, you must make the best of it, Percy, and I promise you that next time there is a boat expedition, if you are not put in, I will say a good word to the first lieutenant for you."
"That promises better than nothing," the boy said, "but I would a deal rather go this time and take my chance next."
"But you see you can't, Percy, and there's no use talking any more about it. I really do not expect there will be any fighting. 2 junks would hardly make any opposition to the boats of the ship, and I expect we shall be back by 9 o'clock with the news that they were well on fire before we came up."
A brush with the Chinese, Part 2.
Percy Adcock, however, was determined to go if possible. He was a favourite among the men, and when he spoke to the bow oar of the gig, the latter promised to do anything he could to aid him to carry out his wishes.
"We are to start at daybreak, Tom, so that it will be quite dark when the boats are lowered. I will creep into the gig before that and hide myself as well as I can under your thwart, and all you have got to do is to take no notice of me. When the boat is lowered I think they will hardly make me out from the deck, especially as you will be standing up in the bow holding on with the boat hook till the rest get on board."
"Well, sir, I will do my best, but if you are caught you must not let it be known that I knew anything about it."
"I won't do that," Percy said. "I don't think there is much chance of my being noticed until we get on board the junks, and then they won't know which boat I came off in, and the first lieutenant will be too busy to say anything. Of course I shall hear about it when I am on board again, but I don't mind that so that I see the fun. Besides, I want to send home some things to my sister, and she will like them all the better if I can tell her I captured them on board some junks we seized and burnt."
The next morning the crews mustered before daybreak. Percy had already taken his place under the bow thwart of the gig. The davits were swung out, and 2 men took their places in her as she was lowered down by the falls. As soon as she touched the water the rest of the crew clambered down by the ladder and took their places. Then Fothergill took his seat in the stern, and the boat pushed off and lay a few lengths away from the ship until the heavier boats put off. As soon as they were under way, Percy crawled out from his hiding place and placed himself in the bow, where he was sheltered by the bodies of the oarsmen from Fothergill's sight. Day was just breaking now, but it was still dark on the water, and the boat rowed very slowly until it became lighter. Percy could just make out the shores of the creek on both sides. They were but 2 or 3 feet above the level of the water, and were evidently submerged at high tide. The creek was about 100 yards wide, and the lad could not see far ahead, for it was full of sharp windings and turnings. Here and there branches joined it, but the boats were evidently following the main channel. After another half hour's rowing the first lieutenant suddenly gave the order, "Easy all!" and the men, looking over the shoulders, saw a village a quarter of a mile ahead, with the 2 junks they had chased the night before lying in front of it. Almost at the same moment a sudden uproar was heard. Drums were beaten and gongs sounded. "They are on the lookout for us," the first lieutenant said. "Mr. Mason, do you keep with me and attack the junk highest up the river. Mr. Bellew
And Mr. Fothergill, do you take the one lower down? Row on, men." The oars all touched the water together, and the 4 boats leapt forward. In a minute the scattering fire of ginghals and matchlocks was opened from the junks, and the bullets pattered on the water around the boats. Percy was now kneeling up in the bow, as they passed a branch channel 300 or 400 yards from the village. He started and leapt to his feet. "There are 4 or 5 junks in that passage, Fothergill. They are pulling out." The first lieutenant heard the words. "Row on, men. Let us finish with these craft ahead before the others get out. This must be that piratical village we have heard about, Mr. Mason, as lying up one of these creeks. That accounts for those 2 junks not going higher up. I was surprised at seeing them here, for they might guess that we should try to get them this morning. Evidently they expected to catch us in a trap." A brush with the Chinese, Part 3. Percy was delighted at finding that, in the excitement caused by his news, the first lieutenant had forgotten to take any notice of his being there without orders, and he returned a defiant nod to the threat conveyed by Fothergill, shaking his fist at him. As they neared the junks, the fire on those on board redoubled, and was aided by that of many villagers gathered on the bank of the creek. Suddenly, from a bank of rushes, 4 cannons were fired. A ball struck the pinnace, smashing in her side. The other boats gathered hastily around and took her crew on board, and then dashed at the junks, which were but 100 yards distant. The valour of the Chinese evaporated as they saw the boats approaching, and scores of them leapt overboard and swam for shore. In another minute the boats were alongside, and the crews scrambling up the sides of the junks. Only a few Chinamen attempted to oppose them. These were speedily overcome, and the British had now time to look round, and saw that 6 junks, crowded with men, had issued from the side creek and were making towards them. "Let the boats tow astern," the lieutenant ordered. "We should have to run the gauntlet of that battery on shore if we were to attack them, and might lose another boat before we reach their side. We will fight them here." The junks approached, those on board firing their guns, yelling and shouting, while the drums and gongs were furiously beaten. "They will find themselves mistaken, Percy, if they think they are going to frighten us with all that noise," Fothergill said. "You young rascal, how did you get on board the boat without being seen? The captain will be sure to suspect I had a hand in concealing you." The tars were now at work firing the matchlocks, with which the deck was strewn, at the approaching junks. As they took steady aim, leaning their pieces on the bulwarks, they did considerable execution among the Chinamen crowded on board the junks, while the shout of the Chinese, for the most part, whistled far overhead. But the guns of the shore battery, which had now been slewed round to bear upon them, opened with a better aim, and several shots came crashing into the sides of the captured junk. "Get ready on board, lads," Fothergill shouted. "Don't wait for them to board you, but the moment they come alongside, lash their rigging towers and spring on board them." The leading junk was now about 20 yards away, and presently grated alongside. Half a dozen sailors at once sprang into her rigging with ropes. After lashing the junks together they leaped down upon her deck, where Fothergill was leading the gig's crew, and some of those rescued from the pinnace, while Mr. Bellew with another party had boarded her at the stern. Several of the Chinese fought stoutly, but the greater part lost heart at seeing themselves attacked. Many began at once to jump overboard, and after 2 or 3 minutes' sharp fighting, the rest either followed their example or were beaten below. A brush with the Chinese, Part 4. Fothergill looked round. The other junk had been attacked by 2 of the enemy, 1 on each side, and the little body of sailors were gathered in her waist, and were defending themselves against an overwhelming number of the enemy. The other 3 piratical junks had been carried somewhat up the creek by the tide that was sweeping inward, and could not for the moment take part in the fight. "Mr. Oliphant is hard pressed, sir,"
he asked the master. "Shall we take the boats?"
"That will be the best plan," Mr. Below replied. "Quick, lads, get the boats alongside and tumble in. There is not a moment to be lost."
The crew at once sprang to the boats and rowed to the other junk, which was but some 30 yards away. The Chinese, absorbed in their contest with the crew of the pinnace, did not perceive the newcomers until they had gained the deck, and with a shout fell furiously upon them. In their surprise and consternation, the pirates did not pause to note that they were still 5 to 1 superior in number, but made a rush for their own vessels. The English at once took the offensive. The first lieutenant with his party boarded one, while the newcomers leapt on to the deck of the other. The panic which had seized the Chinese was so complete that they attempted no resistance whatever, but sprang overboard in great numbers, and swam to the shore, which was but 20 yards away, and in 3 minutes the English were in undisputed possession of both vessels.
"Back again, Mr. Fothergill, or you will lose the craft you captured," Lieutenant Oliphant said. "They have already cut her free." The Chinese, indeed, who had been beaten below by the boarding party, had soon perceived the sudden departure of their captors. Gaining the deck again, they had cut the lashings which fastened them to the other junk, and were proceeding to hoist their sails. They were too late, however. Almost before the craft had way on her, Fothergill and his crew were alongside. The Chinese did not wait for the attack, but at once sprang overboard and made for the shore. The other 3 junks, seeing the capture of their comrades, had already hoisted their sails and were making up the creek. Fothergill dropped an anchor, left 4 of his men in charge, and rowed back to Mr. Oliphant. "What shall we do next, sir?" "We will give those fellows on shore a lesson and silence their battery. 2 men have been killed since you left. We must let the other junks go for the present. 4 of my men were killed and 11 wounded before Mr. Bellew and you came to our assistance. The Chinese were fighting pluckily up to that time, and it would have gone very hard with us if you had not been at hand. They will fight when they think they have got it all their own way, but before we land we shall set fire to the 5 junks we have taken. Do you return and see that the 2 astern are well lighted, Mr. Fothergill. Mr. Mason will see to these 3. When you have done your work, take to your boat and lay off till I join you. Keep the junks between you and the shore, to protect you from the fire of the rascals there." "I cannot come with you, I suppose, Fothergill?" Percy Adcock said, as the midshipman was about to descend into his boat again. "Yes, come along, Percy. It doesn't matter what you do now. The captain will be so pleased when he hears that we have captured and burnt 5 junks that you will get off with a very light scolding, I imagine." "That's just what I was thinking, Jack. Has it not been fun?" "You wouldn't have thought it fun if you had got one of those matchlock balls in your body. There are a good many of our poor fellows just at the present moment who do not see anything funny in the affair at all. Here we are. Clamber on." A Brush with the Chinese, Part 5. The crew soon set to work under Fothergill's orders. The sails were cut off the masts and thrown down into the hold. Bamboos, of which there were an abundance down there, were heaped over them. A barrel of oil was poured over the mass, and the fire then applied. "That will do, lads. Now take to your boats and let's make a bonfire of the other junk." In 10 minutes both vessels were a sheet of flame, and the boat was lying a short distance from them waiting for further operations. The inhabitants of the village, furious at the failure of the plan which had been laid for the destruction of the English, kept up a constant fusillade. This, however, did no harm, for the gig was completely sheltered by the burning junks close to her from their missiles. "There go the others!" Percy exclaimed after a minute or two, as 3 columns of smoke arose simultaneously from the other junks, and the sailors were soon dropping into their boats alongside.
The killed and wounded were placed in the gig with 4 sailors in charge. They were directed to keep under shelter of the junks until rejoined by the Pennant's and Fothergill's gig, after these had done their work on shore. When all was ready, the first lieutenant raised his hand as a signal, and the 2 boats dashed between the burning junks and rowed for the shore. Such of the natives as had their weapons charged fired a hasty volley, and then, as the sailors leapt from their boats, took to their heels. "Mr. Fothergill, take your party into the village and set fire to the houses. Shoot down every man you see. This place is a nest of pirates, and I will capture that battery and then join you." Fothergill and his sailors at once entered the village. The men had already fled. The women were turned out of the houses, and these were immediately set on fire. The tars regarded the whole affair as a glorious joke, and raced from house to house, making a hasty search in each for concealed valuables before setting it on fire. In a short time the whole village was in a blaze.
"There's a house there, standing in that little grove 100 yards away," Percy said.
"It looks like a temple," Fothergill replied. "However, we will have a look at it," and calling 2 sailors to accompany him, he started at a run towards it, Percy keeping by his side. "It is a temple," Fothergill said when they approached it. "Still, we will have a look at it, but we won't burn it. It is as well to respect the religion even of a set of piratical scoundrels like these." At the head of his men he rushed in at the entrance. There was a blaze of fire as half a dozen muskets were discharged in their faces. One of the sailors dropped dead, and before the others had time to realize what had happened, they were beaten to the ground by a storm of blows from swords and other weapons. A heavy blow crashed down on Percy's head, and he fell insensible even before he realized what had occurred. When he recovered, his first sensation was that of a vague wonder as to what had happened to him. He seemed to be in darkness and unable to move hand or foot. He was compressed in some way that he could not at first understand, and was being bumped and jolted in an extraordinary manner. A Brush with the Chinese. Part 6. It was some little time before he could understand the situation. He first remembered the fight with the junks. Then he recalled the landing and burning the village. Then, as his brain cleared, came the recollection of his start with Fothergill for the temple among the trees, his arrival there, and a loud report and flash of fire. "I must have gotten knocked down and stunned," he said to himself, "and I suppose I am a prisoner now, and one of the fellows must be carrying me on his back." Yes, he could understand it all now. His hands and his feet were tied, ropes were passed round his body in every direction, and he was fastened back to back upon the shoulders of a Chinaman. Percy remembered the tales he had heard of the imprisonment and torture of those who fell into the hands of the Chinese, and he bitterly regretted that he had not been killed instead of stunned in the surprise of the temple. "It would have been just the same feeling," he said to himself, "and there would have been an end of it. Now, there is no saying what is going to happen. I wonder whether Jack was killed, and the other sailors." Presently there was a jabber of voices. The motion ceased. Percy could feel that the cords were being unwound, and he was dropped on to his feet. Then the cloth was removed from his head, and he could look round. A dozen Chinese, armed with matchlocks and bristling with swords and daggers, stood round, and among them, bound like himself and gagged by a piece of bamboo forced lengthways across his mouth and kept there with a string going round the back of his head, stood Fothergill. He was bleeding from several cuts in the head. Percy's heart gave a bound of joy at finding that he was not alone. Then he tried to feel sorry that Jack had not escaped, but failed to do so. Although he told himself that his comrade's presence would not in any way alleviate the fate which was certain to befall him, still, the thought of companionship even in wretchedness, and perhaps a vague hope that Jack, with his energy and spirit, might contrive some way for their escape cheered him up. As Percy, too, was gagged, no word could be exchanged by the midshipmen, but they nodded to each other. They were now put side by side and made to walk in the centre of their captors. On the way they passed through several villages, whose inhabitants poured out to gaze at the captives, but the men in charge of them were evidently not supposed to delay, as they passed through without a stop. At last they halted before 2 cottages standing by themselves, thrust the prisoners into a small room, removed their gags, and left them to themselves. A Brush with the Chinese, Part 7. "Well, Percy, my boy, so they caught you too. I'm truly sorry. It was my fault for going with only 2 men into that temple, but as the village had been deserted and scarcely a man was found there, it never entered my mind that there might be a party in the temple."
"Of course not, Jack. It was a surprise altogether. I don't know anything about it, for I was knocked down, I suppose, just as we went in, and the first thing I knew about it was that I was being carried on the back of one of those fellows. I thought it was awful at first, but I don't seem to mind so much now you are with me."
"It is a comfort to have someone to speak to," Jack said. "Yet I wish you were not here, Percy. I can't do you any good, and I shall never cease blaming myself for having brought you into this. I don't know much more about the affair than you do. The guns were fired so close to us that my face was scorched with one of them, and almost at the same instant I got a cut across my cheek with a sword. I had just time to hit at one of them, and then almost at the same moment I got 2 or 3 other blows, and down I went. They threw themselves on the top of me and tied and gagged me in no time. Then I was tied to a long bamboo, and 2 fellows put the ends on their shoulders and went off with me through the fields. Of course I was face downwards, and did not know you were with us till they stopped and loosed me from the bamboo and set me on my feet."
"But what are they going to do with us, do you think, Jack?"
"I should say they are going to take us to Canton and claim a reward for our capture, and there, I suppose, they will cut off our heads, or saw us in 2, or put us to some other unpleasant kind of death. I expect they are discussing it now."
Voices were heard indeed raised in an angry altercation in the next room. After a time the din subsided, and the conversation appeared to take a more amiable turn.
"I suppose they have settled it as far as they are concerned," Jack said. "Anyhow, you may be quite sure they mean to make something out of us. If they hadn't, they would have finished us at once, for they must have been furious at the destruction of their junks and village. As to the idea that mercy has anything to do with it, we may as well put it out of our minds. The Chinaman, at the best of times, has no feeling of pity in his nature, and after their defeat it is certain they would have killed us at once had they not hoped to do better by us. If they had been Indians I should have said they had carried us off to enjoy the satisfaction of torturing us, but I don't suppose it is that with them."
"Do you think there is any chance of our getting away?"
"I should say not the least in the world, Percy. My hands are fastened so tight now that the ropes seem cutting into my wrists, and after they had set me on my feet and cut the cords off my legs, I could scarcely stand at first. My feet were so numbed by the pressure. However, we must keep up our pluck. Possibly they may keep us at Canton for a bit, and, if they do, the squadron may arrive and fight its way past the forts, and take the city before they have quite made up their minds as to what kind of death will be most appropriate to the occasion. I wonder what they are doing now. They seem to be chopping sticks."
"I wish they would give us some water," Percy said. "I am frightfully thirsty."
"And so am I, Percy. There is one comfort, they won't let us die of thirst. They could get no satisfaction out of our deaths now." A Brush with the Chinese. Part 8. 2 hours later, some of the Chinese re-entered the room and led the captives outside, and the lads then saw what was the meaning of the noise they had heard. A cage had been manufactured of strong bamboos. It was about 4.5 feet long, 4 feet wide, and less than 3 feet high. Above it were fastened 2 long bamboos. 2 or 3 of the bars of the cage had been left open.
"My goodness! They never intend to put us in there,"
Percy exclaimed. "That they do," Jack said. "They are going to carry us the rest of the way." The cords which bound the prisoners' hands were now cut, and they were motioned to crawl into the cage. This they did. The bars were then put in their places and securely lashed. 4 men went to the ends of the poles and lifted the cage upon their shoulders. 2 others took their places beside it, and 1 man, apparently the leader of the party, walked on ahead. The rest remained behind. "I never quite realized what a fowl felt in a coop before," Jack said. "But if its sensations are at all like mine, they must be decidedly unpleasant. It isn't high enough to sit upright in. It is nothing like long enough to lie down, and as to getting out, one might as well think of flying. Do you know, Percy, I don't think they mean taking us to Canton at all. I did not think of it before, but from the direction of the sun I feel sure that we cannot have been going that way. What they are up to I can't imagine." In an hour they came to a large village. Here the cage was set down, and the villagers closed round. They were, however, kept a short distance from the cage by the men in charge of it. Then a wooden platter was placed on the ground, and persons throwing a few copper coins into this were allowed to come near the cage. "They're making a show of us," Fothergill exclaimed. "That's what they are up to. You see if it isn't. They are going to travel up country to show the whites whom their valour has captured." This was, indeed, the purpose of the pirates. At that time Europeans seldom ventured beyond the limits assigned to them in the 2 or 3 towns where they were permitted to trade, and few, indeed, of the country people had ever obtained a sight of the white barbarians of whose doings they had so frequently heard. Consequently, a small crowd soon gathered around the cage, eyeing the captives with the same interest they would have felt as to unknown and dangerous beasts. They laughed and joked, passed remarks upon them, and even poked them with sticks. Fothergill, furious at this treatment, caught one of the sticks, and wrenching it from the hands of the Chinaman, tried to strike at him through the bars, a proceeding which excited shouts of laughter from the bystanders.
"I think, Jack," Percy said, "it would be best to try and keep our tempers, and not to seem to mind what they do to us. Then if they find they can't get any fun out of us, they will soon leave us alone."
"Of course, that's the best plan," Fothergill agreed. "But it's not so easy to follow. That fellow very nearly poked out my eye with his stick, and no one's going to stand that if he can help it." It was some hours before the curiosity of the village was satisfied. When all had paid who were likely to do so, the guards broke up their circle, and leaving 2 of their number at the cage to see that no actual harm was caused to their prisoners, the rest went off to a refreshment house. A Brush with the Chinese. Part 9. The place of the elders was now taken by the boys and children of the village, who crawled around the cage, prodding the prisoners with sticks, and, putting their hands through the bars, pulled their ears and hair. This amusement, however, was brought to an abrupt conclusion by Fothergill suddenly seizing the wrist of a big boy and pulling his arm through the cage until his face was against the bars. Then he proceeded to beat him with his own stick until the guard, coming to his rescue, poked Fothergill until he released his hold. The punishment of their comrade excited neither anger nor resentment among the other boys, who yelled with delight at his discomfiture. but it made them more careful in approaching the cage, and though they continued to poke the prisoners with sticks, they did not venture again to thrust a hand through the bars. At sunset the guards again came round, lifted the cage, and carried it into a shed. A platter of dirty rice and a jug of water were put into the cage. Two of the men lighted their long pipes and sat down on guard beside it, and the doors being closed, the captives were left in peace. "If this sort of thing is to go on, as I suppose it is," Fothergill said, "the sooner they cut off our heads the better."
"It is very bad, Jack. I am sore all over with those prods from their sharp sticks."
"I don't care for the pain, Percy, so much as the humiliation of the thing. To be stared at and poked by these curs as if we were wild beasts, when with half a dozen of our men we could send 100 of them scampering. I feel as if I could choke with rage."
"You had better try and eat some of this rice, Jack. It is not very nice, but I dare say we shall get no more until tomorrow night, and we must keep our strength if we can. At any rate, the water is not bad. That's a comfort."
"No thanks to them," Jack growled. "If there had been any bad water in the neighbourhood, they would have given it to us."
For 3 weeks the sufferings of the prisoners continued. Their captors avoided towns, where the authorities would probably at once have taken the prisoners out of their hands. No one would have recognized the two captives as the midshipmen of the Perseus. Their clothes were in rags, torn to pieces by the thrusts of the sharp-pointed bamboos to which they had been daily subjected. The bad food, the cramped position, and the misery with which they suffered had worn both lads to skeletons. Their hair was matted with filth, and their faces begrimed with dirt. Percy was so weak that he felt he could not stand. Fothergill, being 3 years older, was less exhausted, but he knew that he, too, could not support his sufferings for many days longer. Their bodies were covered with sores, and try as they would, they were able to catch only a few minutes' sleep at a time. So much did the bamboo bars hurt their wasted limbs. They seldom exchanged a word during the daytime, suffering in silence the persecutions to which they were exposed. But at night they talked about their homes and friends in England, and their comrades on board ship, seldom saying a word as to their present position. They were now in a hilly country, but had not the least idea of the direction in which it lay from Canton or its distance from the coast. A brush with the Chinese. Part 10. One evening Jack said to his companion, "I think it's nearly all over now, Percy. The last 2 days we have made longer journeys, and have not stopped at any of the smaller villages we passed through. I fancy our guards must see that we can't last much longer, and are taking us down to some town to hand us over to the authorities and get their reward for us." "I hope it is so, Jack. The sooner the better. Not that it makes much difference now to me, for I do not think I can stand many more days of it."
"I am afraid I am tougher than you, Percy, and shall take longer to kill, so I hope with all my heart that I may be right, and that they may be going to give us up to the authorities." The next evening they stopped at a large place, and were subjected to the usual persecution. This, however, was now less prolonged than during the early days of their captivity, for they had now no longer strength or spirits to resent their treatment, and as no fun was to be obtained from passive victims, even the village boys soon ceased to find any amusement in tormenting them. When most of their visitors had left them, an elderly Chinaman approached the side of the cage. He spoke to their guards and looked at them attentively for some minutes. Then he said in pidgin English, "You officer men?" "Yes," Jack exclaimed, starting at the sound of the English words, the first they had heard spoken since their captivity. "Yes, we are officers of the Perseus."
"Me speak English very well," the Chinaman said. "Me pilot man, Many years on Canton River. How you get here?"
"We were attacking some piratical junks, and landed to destroy the village where the people were firing on us. We entered a place full of pirates, and were knocked down and taken prisoners, and carried away up the country. That is 3 weeks ago, and you see what we are now."
"Pirate men very bad," the Chinaman said. "Plunder many junk on river, and kill crew. Me muchie hate them."
"Can you do anything for us?" Jack asked. "You will be well rewarded if you could manage to get us free." The man shook his head.
"Me no see what can do. Me stranger here. Come to stay with wifey. People no do what me ask them. English ships attack Canton. Much fight and take town. People all hate English. Bad country this. People in one village fight against another. Very bad men here."
"How far is Canton away?" Jack asked. "Could you not send down to tell the English we are here?"
14 days journey off," the man said. "No see how can do anything."
"Well," Jack said, "when you get back again to Canton, let our people know what has been the end of us. We shall not last much longer."
"All right," the man said. "We'll see what me can do. What ye think tonight?"
And after saying a few words to the guards, who had been regarding this conversation with an air of surprise, the Chinaman retired. The guards had for some time abandoned the precaution of sitting up at night by the cage, convinced that their captives had no longer strength to attempt to break through its fastenings, or to drag themselves many yards away if they could do so. They therefore left it standing in the open, and, wrapping themselves in their thickly wadded coats, for the nights were cold, lay down by the side of the cage. The coolness of the nights had, indeed, assisted to keep the two prisoners alive. During the day the sun was terribly hot, and the crowd of visitors around the cage impeded the circulation of the air and added to their sufferings. It was true that the cold at night frequently prevented them from sleeping, but it acted as a tonic and braced them up. A Brush with the Chinese, Part 11.
"What did he mean about the villagers attacking each other?"
Percy asked. "I have heard," Jack replied, "that in some parts of China things are very much the same as they used to be in the Highlands of Scotland. There is no law or order. The different villages are like clans and wage war on each other. Sometimes the government sends a number of troops who put the thing down for a time, chop off a good many heads, and then march away, and the whole work begins again as soon as their backs are turned." That night the uneasy slumber of the lads was disturbed by a sudden firing. Shouts and yells were heard, and the firing redoubled. "The village is attacked," Jack said. "I noticed that, like some other places we have come into lately, there is a strong earthen wall around it, with gates. Well, there is one comfort. It does not make much difference to us which side wins." The guards at the first alarm leapt to their feet, caught up their matchlocks, and ran to aid in the defence of the wall. 2 minutes later a man ran up to the cage. "All righty," he said. "Just what me hopey." With his knife he cut through the tough withes that held the bamboos in their places, and pulled out 3 of the bars. "Come along," he said. "No time to lose." Jack scrambled out, but in trying to stand upright gave a sharp exclamation of pain. Percy crawled out more slowly. He tried to stand up, but could not. The Chinaman caught him up and threw him on his shoulder. "Come along, quickly," he said to Jack. "If takee village, kill every one." He set off at a run. Jack followed as fast as he could, groaning at every step from the pain the movement caused to his bruised body. They went to the side of the village opposite to that at which the attack was going on. They met no one on the way, the inhabitants having all rushed to the other side to repel the attack. They stopped at a small gate in the wall. The Chinaman drew back the bolts and opened it, and they passed out into the country, For an hour they kept on. By the end of that time Jack could scarcely drag his limbs along. The Chinaman halted at length in a clump of trees, surrounded by a thick undergrowth.
"Alle safety here," he said. "No searchy so far. Here food."
And he produced from a wallet a cold chicken and some boiled rice, and unslung from his shoulder a gourd filled with cold tea.
"Me go back now. See what happen. Tomorrow nighty come again. Bring ye more food."
And without another word he went off at a rapid pace. Jack moistened his lips with the tea, and then turned to his companion. Percy had not spoken a word since he had been released from the cage, and had been insensible during the greater part of his journey. Jack poured some cold tea between his lips. "Cheer up, Percy, old boy. We are free now, and with luck and that good fellow's help we will work our way down to Canton yet."
"I shall never get down there. You may,"
Percy said feebly. "Oh, nonsense! You will pick up strength like a steam engine now. Here, let me prop you against this tree. That's better. Now drink a drop of this tea. It's like nectar after that filthy water we've been drinking. Now you will feel better. Now you must try and eat a little of this chicken and rice." "Oh, nonsense! You've got to do it. I am not going to let you give way when our trouble is just over. Think of your people at home, Percy, and make an effort for their sakes. Good heavens! Now I think of it, it must be Christmas morning. We were caught on the 2nd, and we have been just 22 days on show. I am sure that it must be past 12 o'clock, and it is Christmas Day. It is a good omen, Percy. This food isn't like roast beef and plum pudding, but it is not to be despised, I can tell you. Come, now, take some. That's a good fellow." A Brush with the Chinese, Part 12. Percy made an effort, and ate a few mouthfuls of rice and chicken. Then he took another draught of tea, and lay down, and was almost immediately asleep. Jack ate his food slowly and contentedly till he finished half the supply. Then he too lay down, and, after a short but hearty thanksgiving for his escape from a slow and lingering death, fell asleep. The sun was rising when he awoke. He opened his eyes and sat up. "Well, Percy, how do you feel this morning?" he asked cheerily.
"I feel too weak to move,"
Percy replied languidly. "Oh, you will be all right when you have sat up and eaten breakfast," Jack said. "Here you are. Here is a wing for you, and this rice is as white as snow, and the tea is first rate. I thought last night after I lay down that I heard a murmur of water, so after we have had breakfast I will look about and see if I can find it. We shall feel like new men after a wash. You look awful, and I am sure I am just as bad." The thought of a wash cheered Percy far more than that of eating, and he sat up and made a great effort to do justice to breakfast. He succeeded much better than he had done the night before, and Jack, although he pretended to grumble, was satisfied with his companion's progress, and finished off the rest of the food. Then he set out to search for water. He had not very far to go. A tiny stream, a few inches wide and 2 or 3 inches deep, ran through the wood from the higher ground. After throwing himself down and taking a drink, he hurried back to Percy. "It is all right, Percy. I have found it. We can wash to our heart's content. Think of that, lad." Percy could hardly stand, but he made an effort, and Jack half carried him to the streamlet. There the lads spent hours. First they bathed their heads and hands, then, stripping, they lay down in the stream and allowed it to flow over them. Then they rubbed themselves with handfuls of leaves dipped in the water, and when at last they put on their rags again, they felt like new men. Percy was able to walk back to the spot they had quitted, with the assistance only of Jack's arm. The latter, feeling that his breakfast had by no means appeased his hunger, now started to search through the wood, and presently returned to Percy laden with nuts and berries. "The nuts are sure to be all right. I expect the berries are too. I have certainly seen some like them in native markets, and I think it will be quite safe to risk it." The rest of the day was spent in picking nuts and eating them. Then they sat down and waited for the arrival of their friend. He came 2 hours after nightfall with a wallet stored with provisions, and told them that he had regained the village unobserved. The attack had been repulsed, but with severe loss to the defenders as well as to the assailants. 2 of their guards had been among the killed. The others had made a great clamour over the escape of the prisoners, and had made a close search throughout the village and immediately round it, for they were convinced that their captives had not had the strength to go any distance. He thought, however, that although they had professed the greatest indignation, and had offered many threats as to the vengeance the government would take upon the village, they would not trouble themselves any further in the matter. They had already reaped a rich harvest from the exhibition, and would divide among themselves the share of their late comrades. Nor was it at all unlikely that, if they were to report the matter to the authorities, they would themselves get into serious trouble for having not handed over the prisoners immediately after their capture. A Brush with the Chinese, Part 13. For a fortnight the old pilot nursed and fed the 2 midshipmen. He had already provided them with native clothes, so that if by chance any villagers should catch sight of them they would not recognize them as the escaped white men. At the end of that time both the lads had almost recovered from the effects of their sufferings. Jack, indeed, had picked up from the first, but Percy for some days continued so weak and ill that Jack had feared that he was going to have an attack of fever of some kind. His companion's cheery and hopeful chat did as much good for Percy as the nourishing food with which their friend supplied them, and at the end of the fortnight he declared that he felt sufficiently strong to attempt to make his way down to the coast. The pilot acted as their guide. When they inquired about his wife, he told them carelessly that she would remain with her kinsfolk, and would travel on to Canton and join him there when she found an opportunity. The journey was accomplished at night, by very short stages at first, but by increasing distances as Percy gained strength. During the daytime the lads lay hid in woods or jungles, while their companion went into a village and purchased food. They struck the river many miles above Canton, and the pilot, going down first to a village on its banks, bargained for a boat to take him and 2 women down to the city. The lads went on board at night and took their places in the little cabin, formed of bamboos and covered with mats, in the stern of the boat, and remained thus sheltered not only from the view of people in boats passing up or down the stream, but from the eyes of their own boatmen. After 2 days' journey down the river without incident, they arrived off Canton, where the British fleet was still lying while negotiations for peace were being carried on with the authorities at Pekin. Peeping out between the mats, the lads caught sight of the English warships, and, knowing that there was now no danger, they dashed out of the cabin, to the surprise of the native boatmen, and shouted and waved their arms to the distant ships. In 10 minutes they were alongside the Perseus, when they were hailed as if restored from the dead. The pilot was very handsomely rewarded by the English authorities for his kindness to the prisoners, and was highly satisfied with the result of his proceedings, which more than doubled the little capital with which he had retired from business. Jack Fothergill and Percy Adcock declare that they have never since eaten chicken without thinking of their Christmas fare on the morning of their escape from the hands of the Chinese pirates. End of Section 9. Recording by Timothy. Section 10 of Tales from the Works of G.A.Henty. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tales from the Works of G.A.Henty by G.A.Henty. The Black Death. From St. George for England. Part 1. Sir Walter Somers, a young knight who had distinguished himself under the Black Prince at Crécy in Poitiers, married Edith Vernon, and, during a lull in the fighting with France, settled down in his castle at Westerham. He had a deadly enemy in a knight who was a relation of his wife's, and whom he had thwarted in an attempt made on her in order to inherit the property. The terrible plague, known in history as the Black Death, 1348-49, which carried off 2/3 of the population of England, breaks out. When the plague reaches the village, Sir Walter goes down with his faithful retainer Ralph to comfort the frightened people. They found the village in a state of panic. Women were sitting crying despairingly at their doors. Some were engaged in packing their belongings in carts ready for flight. Some wandered aimlessly about, wringing their hands, while others went to church, whose bells were mournfully tolling the knell of the departed. Walter's presence soon restored something like order and confidence. His resolute tone cheered the timid and gave hope to the despairing. Sternly he rebuked those preparing to fly, and ordered them instantly to replace their goods in their houses. Then he went to the priest and implored him to cause the tolling of the bell to cease. "There is enough," he said, "in the real danger present to appall even the bravest, and we need no bell to tell us that death is among us. The dismal tolling is enough to unnerve the stoutest heart, and if we ring for all who die, its sounds will never cease while the plague is among us. Therefore, Father, I implore you to discontinue it. Let there be services held daily in the church, but I beseech you strive to cheer the people rather than to depress them, and to dwell more upon the joys that await those who die as Christian men and women than upon the sorrows of those who remain behind. My wife and mother, who will soon be in the village, and will strive to cheer and comfort the people, and I look to you for aid in this matter." The priest, who was naturally a timid man, nevertheless nerved himself to carry out Walter's suggestion, and soon the dismal tones of the bell ceased to be heard in the village. Walter dispatched messengers to all of the outlying farms, desiring his tenants to meet him that afternoon at the castle, in order that steps might be taken for common aid. An hour later Dame Vernon and Edith came down and visited all the houses where the plague had made its appearance, distributing their soups, and by cheering and comforting words raising the spirits of the relatives of the sufferers. The names of all the women ready to aid in the work of nursing were taken down, and in the afternoon at the meeting at the castle the full arrangements were completed. Work was to be carried on as usual in order to occupy men's minds, and prevent them from brooding over the awful effects of the plague. Information of any case that occurred was to be sent to the castle, where soups and medicines were to be obtained. Whenever more assistance was required than could be furnished by the inmates of a house, another woman was to be sent to aid. Boys were told off as messengers to fetch food and other things as required from the castle. So, bravely and firmly, they prepared to meet the pestilence. It spread with terrible severity. There was scarcely a house which did not lose some of its inmates, while in others whole families were swept away. All day Walter and his wife and Dame Vernon went from house to house, although they could do nothing to stay the progress of the pestilence. Their presence and example supported the survivors, and prevented the occurrence of any of the panic and disorder which in most places accompanied it. The Black Death. Part 2. The castle was not exempt from the scourge. First, some of the servants were seized, and 3 men and 4 women died. Walter himself was attacked, but he took it lightly, and 3 days after the seizure passed into a state of convalescence. Dame Vernon was next attacked, and expired 6 hours after the commencement of the illness. Scarcely was Walter upon his feet than Ralph, who had not for a moment left his bedside, was seized. But he too, after being at death's door for some hours, turned the corner. Lastly, Edith sickened. By this time the scourge had done its worst in the village, and 3/5 of the population had been swept away. All the male retainers in the castle had died, and the one female who survived was nursing her dying mother in the village. Edith's attack was a very severe one. Walter, alone now, for Ralph, although convalescent, had not yet left his bed, sat by his wife's bedside, a prey to anxiety and grief. For although she had resisted the first attack, she was now, 36 hours after it had seized her, fast sinking. Gradually her sight and power of speech failed, and she lay quiet and motionless, and it seemed as if life had already departed. Suddenly Walter was surprised by the sound of many heavy feet ascending the stairs. He went out into the anteroom to learn the cause of this strange tumult, when 5 armed men, one of whom was masked, rushed into the room. Walter caught up his sword from the table. "Ruffians!" he exclaimed. "How dare you thus dishonor the abode of death?" Without a word the men sprang upon him. For a moment he defended himself against their attacks, but he was still weak, his guard was beaten down, and a blow felled him to the ground. "Now settle her," the masked man exclaimed, and the band rushed into the adjoining room. They paused, however, at the door at the sight of the lifeless figure on the couch. "We are saved that trouble," one said. "We have come too late." The masked figure approached the couch and bent over the figure. "Yes," he said, "she is dead, and so much the better." Then he returned with the others to Walter. "He breathes yet," he said. "He needs a harder blow than that you gave to finish him. Let him lie here for a while you gather your booty together. Then we will carry him off. There is scarcely a soul alive in the country round, and none will note us as we pass. If we killed him here, his body would be found with wounds upon it, and even in these times some inquiry might be made. Therefore it were best to finish him elsewhere. When he is missed, it would be supposed that he went mad at the death of his wife, and has wandered out and died, maybe in the woods, or has drowned himself in a pond or stream. Besides, I would that before he dies he should know what hand has struck the blow, and that my vengeance, which he slighted and has twice escaped, has overtaken him at last." The Black Death. Part 3. After ransacking the principal rooms and taking all that was valuable, the band of marauders lifted the still insensible body of Walter, and carrying it downstairs flung it across a horse. One of the ruffians mounted behind it, and the others also getting into their saddles, the party rode away. They were mistaken, however, in supposing that the Lady Edith was dead. She was indeed very nigh the gates of death, and had it not been for the disturbance, would assuredly have speedily entered them. The voice of her husband raised in anger, the clash of steel, followed by the heavy fall, had awakened her dazed senses. Consciousness had at once partly returned to her, but as yet no power of movement. She had heard the words of those who entered her chamber, as if they were spoken afar off. More and more distinctly she heard their movements about the room, but it was not until silence was restored that she came to herself completely. Then, with a sudden rush, the blood seemed to course through her veins, her eyes opened, and her tongue was loosened, and with a scream she sprang up and stood by the side of the bed. She hurried into the next room. A pool of blood on the floor showed her that what she had heard had not been a dream. Snatching up a cloak of her husband's, which lay on a couch, she wrapped it around her, and with hurried steps made her way along the passages until she reached the apartment occupied by Ralph. The latter sprang up in bed with a cry of astonishment. He had heard but an hour before from Walter that all hope was gone, and thought for an instant that the figure he saw was an apparition from the dead. The ghastly pallor of the face, the eyes burning with a strange light, the wild hair and disordered appearance of the lady might well have alarmed one living in even less superstitious times. Ralph was beginning to cross himself hastily, and to mutter a prayer, when he was recalled to himself by the sound of Edith's voice.
"Quick, Ralph," she said. "Arise and clothe yourself. Hasten, for your life. My lord's enemies have fallen upon him and wounded him grievously, even if they have not slain him, and have carried him away. They would have slain me also, had they not thought I was already dead. Arise and mount. Summon everyone still alive in the village, and follow these murderers. I will pull the alarm bell of the castle."
Ralph sprang from his bed as Edith left. He had heard the sound of many footsteps in the knight's apartments, but had deemed them those of the priest come to administer the last rites of the church to his dying mistress. Rage and anxiety for his master gave strength to his limbs. He threw on a few clothes and rushed down to the stables, where the horses stood with great piles of forage and pails of water before them, placed there 2 days before by Walter, when their last attendant died. Without waiting to saddle it, Ralph sprang upon the back of one of the animals, and taking the halters of 4 others, started at a gallop down to the village. The Black Death. Part 4. His news spread like wildfire, for the ringing of the alarm bell of the castle had drawn all to their doors and prepared them for something strange. Some of the men had already taken their arms and were making their way up to the castle when they met Ralph. There were but 5 men in the village who had altogether escaped the pestilence. Others had survived its attacks, but were still weak. Horses there were in plenty. The 5 men mounted at once, with 3 others who, though still weak, were still able to ride. So great was the excitement that 7 women, who had escaped the disease, armed themselves with their husbands' swords and leapt on horseback, declaring that, women though they were, they would strike a blow for their beloved lord, who had been as an angel in the village during the plague. Thus it was scarcely more than 10 minutes after the marauders had left the castle before a motley band, 15 strong, headed by Ralph, rode off in pursuit, while some of the women of the village hurried up to the castle to comfort Edith with the tidings that the pursuit had already commenced. Fortunately, a lad in the fields had noticed the 5 men ride away from the castle, and was able to point out the direction they had taken. At a furious gallop, Ralph and his companions tore across the country. Mile after mile passed. Once or twice they gained news from labourers in the field of the passage of those before them, and knew that they were on the right track. They had now entered a wild and sparsely inhabited country. It was broken and rolling, so that although they knew that the men they were pursuing were but a short distance ahead, they had not yet caught sight of them. They hoped that, having no reason to dread any immediate pursuit, these would soon slacken their pace. This expectation was realized, for on coming over a brow they saw the party halted at a turf-burner's cottage in the hollow below. 3 of the men had dismounted. 2 of them were examining the hoof of one of the horses, which had apparently cast a shoe or trodden upon a stone. Ralph had warned his party to make no sound when they came upon the fugitives. The sound of the horses' hoofs was deadened by the turf, and they were within 100 yards of the marauders before they were perceived. Then Ralph uttered a shout, and brandishing their swords, the party rode down at a headlong gallop. The dismounted men leapt to their saddles and galloped off at full speed, but their pursuers were now close upon them. Ralph and 2 of his companions, who were mounted upon Walter's best horses, gained upon them at every stride. 2 of them were overtaken and run through. The man who bore Walter before him, finding himself being rapidly overtaken, threw his burden onto the ground just as the leader of the party had checked his horse and was about to deliver a sweeping blow at the insensible body. With a curse at his follower for ridding himself of it, he again galloped on. The man's act was unavailing to save him, for he was overtaken and cut down before he had ridden many strides. Then Ralph and his party instantly reined up to examine the state of Walter, who was found to be still breathing, and the 2 survivors of the band of murderers continued their flight unmolested. End of Section 10. Recording by Timothy.
Section 11 of Tales from the Works of G.A.Henty. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dale Grothman. Tales from the Works of G.A.Henty. The White Ship. From the Reign of Terror by G.A.Henty. Harry Sandwith was acting as a companion to the sons of a great French noble when the Revolution broke out. The Marquis and his wife were massacred by the mob. Their sons, in trying to make their escape from the country, were seized and put to death. Harry Sandwith found himself left in charge of the 2 daughters, who, accompanied by an old nurse, traveled with him in disguise to Nantes. Here they lived in seclusion for a time, Harry trying to obtain a passage for them in a smuggling craft. Nantes is in the hands of revolutionists, who, under the direction of the infamous Carrier, the commissioner from Paris, are massacring wholesale all suspected of hostility. There is much illness and distress in the town, and the ladies, by their kindness to the sick, win the hearts of some of the sailors, so that, finally, arrangements for escape are made. Before they can be carried out, however, the girls are seized and thrown into prison, the ordinary modes of execution being found too slow to clear the prisons of the numbers of those brought in daily under the charge of being aristocrats. Carrier organizes what are known in history as noyades. He procured a number of boats and had them moored in the middle of the stream. The prisoners, men, women, and children, were placed on board. Holes were cut in the bottom to cause the craft to sink, while troops lined the river and fired with artillery and musketry at those who endeavored to swim to shore. Harry, hearing of this infamous design and learning which craft the girls will be placed on, determines to effect their rescue. He is taken on board the boat at night, and with the assistance of the sailors prepares the hatchway of the cabin as a means of escape. The sailors then row off and leave him to himself. 1. The White Ship. When left alone, Harry blew out the other candles, but left that in the lantern burning, and threw himself down on the locker, and thought over every detail of the work for the next day. As he had said, the great danger was of Virgie's struggling, and being too frightened to follow his instructions. Certainly he could fasten a rope around her, but even then it might be difficult to manage her. The next danger was that other persons might cling to the hatchway. Harry felt the long knife, which was concealed in his breast. God grant I may not have to use it, he said, but If it must be, I shall not hesitate. They would simply destroy us without saving themselves, that is certain. Therefore, I am justified in defending the girls, as I would against any other enemy." He knelt down and prayed for some time. Then he replaced the piece they had cut out from the hatch, fixed the beams beneath it, and lay down again. He was worn out by the excitement of the day, and in spite of his anxiety about the morrow, he presently fell off to sleep. It was long before he woke. When he did so, he looked through one of the auger holes into the hold, and saw the light streaming down the open hatchway, and could tell that the sun was already up. He ate the food that Martha had placed in his pocket just as he was starting, saw that the bundle of corks was ready at hand, and the ropes attached to them so placed that they could be fastened on in an instant. Then there was nothing to do but wait. Time passed slowly. Presently he heard the sound of drums and bugles, and knew that the troops were taking up their positions on the quays. At last, it seemed many hours to him, he heard the splash of oars, and presently felt a slight shock, as a boat ran alongside the lugger. Then there were voices, and the sound of feet above, as persons mounted onto the deck. There was a scraping noise by the lugger's side, and immediately afterward another bump, as a second boat took the place of the first. This, as far as Harry could hear, did not leave the lugger. There was a great hum of talking on the deck, principally in women's voices, and persons so often stepped on the hatch that Harry was glad the beams gave a solid support to it. The White Ship 2. Half an hour passed, as well as Harry could judge. Then the boom of a cannon was heard, and immediately 2 men leapt down into the hold, knocked the 6 plugs out of their place, and climbed up on deck again. There was again the scraping noise, and Harry knew the boat had pushed off, this time for good. He watched 6 jets of water for a minute or two. Then, saying to himself, "It is time," he knocked the beams from their ledges, allowed the square of wood to fall, lifted the hatch, and pushed it off its coaming, and clambered onto the deck with the corks and ropes. There were some 50 persons on board, for the most part women and children, but with 2 or 3 men among them. They were gathered near the stern, and were apparently watching the scene ashore with astonishment. He hurried aft, having no fear that at this distance from the shore his figure would be recognized from the rest, and if it were, it mattered not. 2 or 3 turned round as the supposed sailor came aft, exclaiming, "What does this mean? Why were we put here aboard these white ships? What are they going to do with us?" "Alas, ladies," he said, "they have put you here to die. They have bored holes in the ship's bottoms, and in a few minutes they will sink. It is wholesale execution." As he began to speak, one of the ladies in the stern pushed her way through the rest. "Oh, Harry, is it you?" she exclaimed as he finished. "Is it true? Are we to die together?" "We're in God's hands, Jeannie, but there is hope yet. Bring Virginie forward with me." At Harry's first words a panic had seized all around. 1 or 2 ran to the hatchway and looked down into the hold, and screamed out that the water was rushing in. Then some cried to the distant crowd to send and save them. Others ran up and down as if demented, while some threw themselves on their knees. But panic soon passed away. All had for weeks looked death in the face, and though the unexpected form in which it had appeared had for a moment shaken them, they soon recovered. Mothers clasped their daughters to their breasts for a last farewell, and then all with bowed heads kneeled and listened in silence to an old man who began to pray aloud. Jeannie, without a word, had taken Virginie's hand, and accompanied Harry forward to the fore part of the deck. "Jeannie, I'm going to try to save you and Virginie, but everything depends on your being cool and brave. I need not urge you, because I am sure of you. Virginie, will you try to be cool for Jeannie's sake and your own? If we do not, we must all die together." "What are we to do, Harry?" Jeannie said steadily, with Virginie clinging to her sister, sobbing bitterly. "Fasten this bundle of corks between Virginie's shoulders, high up. Yes, there." The White Ship 3. While Jeannie was doing this, Harry fastened a rope to a ring on the side of the hatch. Then he tied the corks to Jeannie's shoulders, and adjusted a third bundle to his own. "Now, Jeannie," he said, "I will tell you what we are to do. You see this hatch? When the vessel sinks it will float, and we must float on our backs, with our faces underneath it, so that it will hide us from the sight of the wretches on shore. Even if they pull out in boats to kill any who are swimming or clinging to spars, they will not suspect that there is anyone under this. We may not succeed. An accident may betray us. But there is a possibility. At any rate, dear, we shall live or die together." "I am content," Jeannie said quietly. "You know, Jeannie," Harry said, putting his hands on the girl's shoulders, "that I love you. I should never have told you so until we got home, if it hadn't been for this. But though I have never said it, you know I love you." "I know, Harry, and I love you too, with all my heart. So much that I can feel almost happy that we are to die together." As Jeannie finished speaking, there was a sudden crash. Impatient at the length of time the vessels were in sinking, those ashore had opened fire with cannons upon them, and the shot had struck the lugger just above the water. With a little cry, Virginie fell senseless on the deck. "That's the best thing that could have happened," Harry said, as Jeannie swooped to her sister. "Lie down on the deck, dear, or you may be struck. They are firing with muskets now. I am going to lie down too," he said in answer to her look, "but I shall first twist this cord around Virginie so as to keep her arms by her side. Otherwise, when the water touches her, she may come to her senses and struggle. That's all right." Then he lay down on the deck between the girls, with his head against the hatch and holding the rope. "Put your head on my shoulder, Jeannie, and I will put my arm around you. I will hold Virginie the same way on the other side. Hold tight by me for a moment as we sink. I may have to use my arms to get the hatch over our faces. Do not breathe while you are under the water, for we shall, no doubt, go down with the lugger, although I shall try to keep you afloat. When you are under the hatch, you will find you will float with your mouth well out of the water, and will be able to breathe. The corks will keep you up." "I understand, Harry. Now let's pray until the time comes." Shot after shot struck the lugger. Then Harry felt her give a sudden lurch. There was a wild cry, and the next moment she went down stern first. She was so nearly even with the water when she sank that there was less downward suck than Harry had expected, and striking out with his feet, his head was soon above the surface. The cord had kept the hatch within a couple of feet of him, and with some difficulty, owing to the buoyancy of the corks, he thrust himself and the girls under it. The tarpaulin was old and rotten, and the light penetrated in several places, and Harry could see that, in the position in which they were lying, the faces of both girls were above the water. It was useless to speak, for their ears were submerged, but a slight motion from Jeannie responded to the pressure of his arm, and he knew she was sensible, although she had not made the slightest movement from the moment the vessel sank. The White Ship 4. Virginie had not, as he feared would be the case, recovered her senses with the shock of the immersion, but lay insensible on his shoulder. He could see by the movement of Jeannie's lips that she was praying, and he too thanked God that he had given success to the plan so far, and prayed for protection to the end. Every minute that passed, his hopes rose. Everything had answered beyond his expectations. The other victims had apparently not even noticed what he was doing, and therefore had not, as he feared might be the case, interfered with his preparations, nor had any of them striven to gain hold on the hatchway. The sinking of the vessel and the tearing up of the water by the shot would render the surface disturbed and broken, and decrease the chances of the floating hatch attracting attention. After 10 minutes had passed, he felt certain that they must be below the point where the troops were assembled. The tide was running out strong, for the time for the massacre had been fixed at an hour which would ensure the bodies being swept down to the sea. Half an hour, he thought, would take them past the bend, where their friends would be waiting for them. The time seemed endless, for although Harry felt the coldness of the water but a little for himself, he knew that it must be trying indeed for Jeannie. As far as he could see her face, it was as white as her sister's, but he had hold of one of her hands now, and knew that she was still conscious. At last he heard the sound of oars. It might not be one of the friendly boats, but the probability was that it was one or the other of them. Had they seen any other fishermen's boats near the point, they would have rowed high up so as to intercept the hatch before it reached the stranger. Harry could not hear voices, for although the water had conveyed the sound of oars a considerable distance, he could hear no sound in the air. The oars came nearer and nearer, and by the quickness with which the strokes followed each other, he knew that two boats were at hand. When the hatch was suddenly lifted, and as Harry raised his head above the water, there was a loud cheer, and he saw Adolphe and Pierre, one on each side, stretching out their arms to him. The girls were first lifted into Pierre's boat, for Jeannie was as unable to move as her sister, and then Harry was dragged in, the rough sailor shaking his hand and patting him on the shoulder, while the tears ran down their cheeks. As soon as Jeannie was able to sit up, she began to chafe one of Virginie's hands, while Harry took the other. "Take off her shoes, Pierre, and soak a cloth in hot water, and put it on her feet." But with all these efforts, it was not until they were close to Pierre's village that Virginie opened her eyes. When they arrived at the causeway, the two girls were wrapped up in peasants' clothes that Pierre had brought for them. Jeannie took Harry's arms, while Adolphe lifted Virginie and carried her up. Henrietta was standing at the door as Jeannie staggered in with Harry. "That's right, mademoiselle. Thank God, who has brought you safe through the danger. Now do not stop a moment, but come in here and get into bed. It is all ready for you. The blankets have been before the fire until the moment you landed. They will soon give you warmth. And do you, Monsieur Sandwith, hurry up to the loft and get on dry clothes." Finally they succeeded in getting on board a smuggling lugger and arrived safely in England. End of Section 11, The White Ship.